The morning smelled like cold asphalt and someone else's panic. Ethan Cole was still on his first cup of coffee when Sophie grabbed his arm and pointed. Across the Granger Elementary parking lot, a white Honda Civic sat crooked near the entrance, hazard lights blinking in slow, helpless pulses. A woman stood beside it, one hand pressed to the roof, the other clutching a canvas tote full of papers, threatening to scatter in the October wind. Sophie was already unbuckling her seatbelt. "That's Miss Weston, Daddy." Her car broke. Ethan set down his cup. He didn't say anything. He just got out. He crossed the parking lot at an easy pace, just the walk of a man who had already decided what he was going to do before his brain finished catching up. The woman beside the Honda turned when she heard his boots on the pavement. She had dark-rimmed glasses and a slight furrow between her brows that suggested she had been standing there longer than she wanted to admit. Sophie came sprinting up beside him, her backpack bouncing with every step. "Miss Weston, this is my dad," she announced, as if introducing a keynote speaker. "He fixes everything." Ethan gave a single nod. "Ethan Cole. Mind if I check under the hood?" Claire Weston blinked. "Please. Yes. It just died on Millbrook, no warning at all. I thought maybe the battery, but I don't really know." She stopped herself. "You don't need the whole story. It's fine," he said. He was already at the hood latch. He popped the hood and leaned in. The October air carried the sharp smell of burnt rubber and dry heat rising from the engine block. He didn't need long. The serpentine belt had snapped clean and coiled into itself like a discarded ribbon. One end still wrapped around the crankshaft pulley, the rest collapsed at the bottom of the engine bay. The coolant reservoir was bone dry. Two problems, both fixable, one of them right now. He straightened up, wiped his palms on the legs of his jeans, and walked back to his truck without a word. Sophie stationed herself beside Claire like a self-appointed ambassador. "He keeps spare parts in the toolbox," she said helpfully. "He fixed our furnace last winter. And the kitchen sink. And Sophie." His voice came from behind the truck bed, calm and without edge. "I'm just saying," Sophie murmured to Claire, completely unbothered. Claire smiled despite herself. It was the first time since she had pulled over that the tension in her shoulders had loosened even slightly. Around them, other parents rolled past in their SUVs and minivans, windows up, eyes forward, already running the calculations of their own mornings. Not a single one slowed down. Ethan worked quickly and without fanfare. He cut a short section from a spare belt he kept coiled in the toolbox, not a permanent fix, but enough to get the car to a shop without risk, clamped it properly at both ends, and topped off the coolant from the plastic jug he carried for long county roads in autumn. He had learned years ago that being prepared wasn't pessimism, it was just arithmetic. "Try it now," he said. Claire climbed in and turned the key. The engine caught on the first try, settled into a clean idle, no shudder, no warning lights. She stepped back out and looked at him the way people sometimes look at a thing they didn't expect to work, with an expression that hadn't quite caught up to the moment yet. It wasn't the polished thank you of someone who had rehearsed gratitude. It was something unfiltered and immediate, a kind of relief that sat right next to something she hadn't planned on feeling. "That was, I don't even know what to say," she started. Ethan was already looking for something to wipe his hands on. He found a rag in his back pocket, worked the grease off his knuckles, and gave a short shrug. "Belt's temporary. You'll want to get it to a proper shop today or tomorrow. Ask for a full serpentine replacement, not just the section, and keep an eye on the coolant until you get there." "I will," she said. Then, because it seemed like he might simply walk away if she didn't stop him, "Thank you, Mr. Cole." "Really, Ethan," he said. Sophie beamed at both of them like she had personally arranged the whole thing. That afternoon, Claire kept a small group of students late to help reorganize the classroom's map wall, a project that had been half-finished since September. Sophie had not been on the original list, but she appeared at Claire's elbow the moment the final bell rang with the particular confidence of someone who had already made the decision for everyone involved. "I can help," Sophie said. It was not phrased as a question. By the time Claire had handed out the tape and poster strips, Sophie was already explaining the geography of the Pacific Northwest to the only other child who had stayed, a quiet boy named Owen, with the authority of someone who had personally visited Oregon. Claire let her. There was something about Sophie Cole that made you want to give her room. When they finished, Owen's mother collected him, and the classroom fell into the particular quiet of an empty school building in late afternoon, the hum of the heater, the distant sound of a janitor's cart in the hallway, the October light going orange through the windows. Sophie sat at the edge of Claire's desk, swinging her legs, telling a story about the garage that seemed to have no clear beginning and no clear destination but was thoroughly enjoyable nonetheless. Claire moved around the room, tidying shelves and straightening chairs, and Sophie talked, and it was the kind of unremarkable late afternoon that settles quietly over places where people have started to feel at ease. "Ba has this whole wall of tools," Sophie said. "Every single one has a spot. If one's missing, he knows right away. He says a tool without a home is a tool you'll never find when you need it." Claire looked up from the stack of papers she was sorting. "He sounds organized." "He's really good at taking care of things," Sophie said, simply in the tone of a fact rather than a compliment. Then, without any particular transition, she added, "My mom died when I was 4. The sorting stopped. She got sick," Sophie continued. "Ba doesn't talk about her much, but he still keeps her picture on the desk. I think he misses her a lot but doesn't know how to say it out loud." Claire set down the papers entirely. She didn't reach for the girl, didn't rush to offer something soft and reassuring, didn't pivot to a lighter topic the way most adults did when a child handed them something heavy without warning. She just sat with it, let the words take up the space they were owed. "She sounds like she was important," Claire said finally, quietly. "She was," Sophie agreed. Then she hopped off the desk because she heard a familiar engine in the parking lot. What Sophie did not see, what she could not have known, was that Ethan had been standing outside the classroom door for nearly 2 minutes. He had arrived, raised his hand to knock, and then heard his daughter's voice through the small rectangular window in the door. He had not meant to listen. But he had heard. He had stood there and watched through that narrow pane of glass as Claire Weston sat across from his 7-year-old daughter, completely still, and simply listened. No performance of sympathy, no redirecting, no uncomfortable laughter or the particular tight smile people got when they didn't know what to do with grief. She had just stayed in it with Sophie, unhurried, as if the moment were exactly as important as it was. Ethan had seen a lot of people not know what to do with what his daughter carried. He had watched teachers get flustered and kind but clumsy. He had watched relatives pivot to snacks or homework or the weather. He had done it himself more times than he wanted to count, turning away from the weight of it because he was already so deep inside his own. He stood at that door longer than made sense for a man who had simply come to pick up his kid. Then he knocked. 2 weeks later, the Granger Elementary Parent-Teacher Conference was scheduled for a Thursday evening in the school gymnasium. Folding tables arranged in rows, fluorescent lights doing their flat best, the smell of institutional coffee drifting from a cart near the entrance. Ethan arrived 5 minutes late. He had come straight from a job, a transmission rebuild that had run long, and there was a pale arc of grease at his right elbow that a quick pass with a paper towel had not quite erased. He took the last open seat at the back of the room and did not apologize for his timing. Claire Weston stood at the front in a burgundy blouse, a notepad in one hand, and the composed expression of someone who had done this many times and still took it seriously every time. The parents around Ethan sat in pressed shirts and blazers. He put his hands in his jacket pockets and listened. She covered the usual things: first reading levels, math benchmarks, the state of the classroom's reading corner. Then she said she wanted to share something she had noticed in the first graders as a whole and something she had noticed in a few students in particular. The room settled. She talked about Sophie without naming her right away. She said there was a student in her class who had developed an unusual habit over the first weeks of school. This child, she said, had been observed dividing her own afternoon snack, the portion that came from home, that belonged entirely to her, and quietly passing half of it to a classmate who regularly arrived without one. Not once. Repeatedly, without being asked, without mentioning it. "Last week," Claire said, "this student placed a handwritten note in the desk drawer of a classmate who had been crying at recess." She paused. "I asked her about it afterward. She said, if I sign it, she'll feel like she has to say thank you, and I don't need her to say thank you." The room was quiet. Ethan's hand tightened on the arm of the folding chair. He had not known about any of this. Not the snack, not the note. He had known Sophie was. Sophie had known it in the way you know the weather of a place you've lived in a long time, without being able to describe it precisely to someone who's never been. But he had not known this. When the room began to clear and parents collected coats and gathered into small conversations near the exit, Ethan stayed in his chair. He waited until the last couple had headed toward the door. Then he stood up and walked to the front. "Miss Weston." She looked up from gathering her notes. "Mr. Cole, I'm glad you could make it." "The note," he said. "How long ago did that happen?" "The day she wrote it," Claire said. "I saw her fold it and slip it in the desk while the other students were at recess. She thought I wasn't watching." He nodded slowly. "She told you she didn't need to be thanked." Word for word. He stood there for a moment with nothing useful to add. In 4 years of raising Sophie alone, he had told himself often enough that he knew his daughter knew her rhythms, her logic, the particular way she moved through the world. Standing in that emptied gymnasium under the flat fluorescent light, he understood he had known her the way you know the surface of something, and there were layers he had not thought to look for. Then he picked up his jacket and walked toward the exit. His footsteps were slower going out than they had been coming in. Marcus Webb had known Ethan Cole since the 7th grade and had therefore developed a fine-tuned instinct for when Ethan was thinking about something he had decided not to talk about. The sign was not agitation or distraction. The sign was the opposite, a particular kind of stillness that settled over him like a second coat, the kind that made him look like he was paying close attention to whatever was directly in front of him, while actually being somewhere else entirely. Marcus noticed it on a Wednesday, 3 weeks after the conference. Ethan was recalibrating the alignment on a late-model sedan and had reached for his phone twice in 12 minutes without an incoming call or message. "You expecting something?" Marcus asked. "No," Ethan said, and put the phone back in his pocket. Marcus decided to let it go. He was not a man who needed to win every conversation. That evening, Sophie reported over dinner that Miss Weston ate her lunch at her desk most days. Not always. Sometimes she ate outside, alone on the bench by the field, but she hadn't found her way into the group of teachers who ate together in the break room. The other teachers weren't unfriendly, Sophie explained, with the precise sociological analysis of a 7-year-old who had spent considerable time observing adult dynamics. They just already had a thing going. Miss Weston hadn't been there long enough to become part of it yet. Sophie delivered this the way she delivered most information, plainly and without editorial comment. The way a person states the temperature, it was just a thing that was true. Ethan set down his fork. He looked at his plate for a moment. Then he picked the fork back up and didn't say anything. And the conversation moved on to Sophie's science project, and the evening continued as evenings did. But after Sophie was in bed, Ethan sat at the kitchen table with a glass of water and did not drink it. He thought about the bench by the field, which he could picture clearly enough without having seen it. He knew something about the kind of loneliness that doesn't announce itself, that just sits quietly in the background of a person's days like a low hum you stop consciously hearing but never stop feeling. He got up, put the glass in the sink, and went to bed. The following week, Marcus picked up Sophie on Tuesday and Thursday. Ethan told him there was backlog at the garage. Marcus looked at the schedule board, which showed 2 cars, neither urgent, and said nothing. He had said nothing in situations like this before, and he had found it was generally the right call. Ethan would get there on his own or he wouldn't, and Marcus's job, as he understood it, was to show up and not make things harder. He picked up Sophie both days and brought her home and made her a peanut butter sandwich and they watched half an episode of a nature documentary about sea otters, which Sophie found deeply informative. On Thursday night, Ethan stayed in the garage until past 11. He ran a diagnostic on a truck that didn't need one, reorganized the socket drawer that was already organized, and changed the oil on his own pickup a week before it was due. The garage was warm from the space heater in the corner and quiet except for the occasional settling of the metal roof. He worked with the focused, deliberate pace of a man keeping himself occupied rather than doing anything necessary. He went to bed without eating. The rain arrived on a Friday afternoon without much warning, the kind of fast October rain that comes from the northwest and doesn't negotiate. By the time Ethan reached the school at 3:15, the sky was a flat, pewter gray, and the drops were coming down hard enough to bounce off the asphalt. He pulled into the pickup lane and joined the line of idling cars. Through the windshield, past the sweeping wipers, he could see the covered entrance and the stream of children coming out in yellow slickers. He saw Sophie almost immediately, waving from the doorway with the energetic certainty of a child who knows she has been spotted. And just behind her, standing a few steps back under the narrow overhang that did not extend far enough to be genuinely useful, was Claire Weston. She had her canvas tote in one hand and her car keys in the other, and the collapsed umbrella he now remembered she had mentioned having forgotten in her apartment, and her left shoulder had darkened with rain where the overhang ended. She was watching the parking lot with the patient expression of someone who had accepted that this was simply what was happening now. Around her, parents hustled past with hoods up and umbrellas open, focused entirely on their own trajectories. The drop-off line moved in bursts. Nobody stopped. Nobody slowed. Ethan watched the wipers make 2 full passes. Then he leaned back, reached under the rear seat, and pulled out the collapsible umbrella he kept there out of habit, a habit that had started, specifically, because Rebecca had put an umbrella in every vehicle they owned and made it clear that its staying there was non-negotiable, and old habits of that particular kind tend to outlast the people who installed them. He got out of the truck, pulled up his collar against the rain, and walked up the sidewalk. He held the umbrella out to Claire without preamble or explanation. She looked at it for a moment, then she looked at him. The rain was coming down steadily between them, tapping on the umbrella's canopy and on the shoulders of his jacket, which were already well past damp. "You're going to get soaked," she said. "I've been soaked before," he said. She took the umbrella. He turned and walked back to the truck. Sophie climbed in a minute later, rain-spotted and wearing the particular expression she got when she had processed something thoroughly and reached a conclusion. She buckled her seatbelt without being asked, which was notable, and sat quietly while Ethan pulled out of the lot and made the right turn onto Millbrook Avenue. The wipers went back and forth. The heater pushed warm air through the vents. The rain stippled the windshield between passes. Sophie waited until they were fully clear of the school zone before she spoke. "Do you want to invite Miss Weston to dinner sometime?" she asked. "No," Ethan said. "Why not?" "I'm busy." Sophie turned and looked out the passenger window at the wet fields rolling past, their October colors muted and dark in the rain. The road ran straight between old fence lines and bare-branched trees that had already given up most of their leaves. "You're not busy tonight," she said. "I know your schedule." Ethan kept his eyes on the road. The rain drummed evenly on the cab roof. A truck coming the other way threw up a brief spray of water as it passed. The silence that followed lasted the rest of the drive home. It filled the cab without being heavy. It was more like the silence of 2 people who have run out of ways to disagree about something that has already been decided. Sophie did not push. Ethan did not explain. They pulled up the gravel drive, and Sophie collected her backpack, and they went inside, and neither of them mentioned it again that evening. But Ethan stood at the kitchen window for a long moment while the water boiled for dinner, looking at the rain on the glass, and didn't move until he heard Sophie ask from the other room whether they had ketchup. The drawing came home in Sophie's backpack on a Friday. It was a school assignment family, in colored pencil, labeled in the careful block print of a child who was proud of her handwriting. Sophie placed it on the kitchen table and went to the living room to watch television, as if delivering it required no further involvement on her part. Ethan found it while he was setting out plates for dinner. He stood at the kitchen table and looked at it for longer than he intended to. 3 figures. A tall one on the left, labeled Daddy in green pencil. A smaller one in the middle, labeled Sophie in purple. A third figure on the right, similar height to the first, labeled Miss Weston in blue. All 3 were holding hands. He stood there in the quiet of the kitchen, the hum of the refrigerator, the faint sound of the television from the other room, the tick of the porch light switching on as the evening came down, and he looked at the drawing the way you look at something that has said a thing plainly that you have been working very hard not to say yourself. Sophie had not discussed it with him beforehand. She had not left a note or an explanation. She had simply made a decision, executed it with the confidence of someone who had thought it through carefully, and then gone to watch television. Which was, Ethan reflected, a remarkably efficient approach. He folded the drawing carefully along its original crease and placed it in the kitchen drawer beneath the takeout menus and the spare batteries and the birthday candles they never seemed to use. Then he set out the plates and called Sophie for dinner. They were halfway through a meal of pasta and green beans when Sophie set down her fork with the quiet deliberateness of a person who has been waiting for the right moment and has decided this is it. "What do you think of Miss Weston?" she asked. "She's a good teacher," Ethan said. Sophie picked up her fork again, turned it once in her hand, and put it back down. "That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking if you like her." Ethan set his fork down too. He looked at his daughter across the table. She was 7 years old, with her hair in 2 uneven ponytails because she had done them herself that morning and refused help, and she was watching him with the patient, unblinking attention of someone who already knew the answer and was simply waiting for him to catch up to it. There was no performance in her expression, no guile, just the clean, direct gaze of a child who had decided the time for indirection was over. He didn't answer. He sat with the question the way you sit with something you haven't decided how to carry yet. Outside, the wind moved through the yard. A car passed on the road at the end of the drive. Sophie gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. She picked up her fork and went back to her pasta. The question had been asked. The answer had been received in the silence that followed it, and she was, apparently, satisfied. Ethan looked down at his plate. He thought about the drawing folded in the kitchen drawer, the 3 figures, the careful lettering, the hands held in blue and green and purple crayon. He thought about the logic of a 7-year-old who does not have the language to say what she means, so she draws it instead and leaves it where you will find it. Somewhere under the weight of 4 years of getting up early and working late and making lunches and fixing things and keeping everything running, so Sophie had a stable floor to stand on somewhere underneath all of that. Something small and specific had been sitting very quietly, waiting to be named. He had felt it edging toward shape for weeks. His daughter had just drawn the outline for him. He finished his dinner. He washed the dishes. He said nothing more about it, but the kitchen felt different than it had an hour before, and he was aware of that in the way you are aware of a season changing not all at once, but undeniably, and without the possibility of going back to what it was before. The cardboard box had been in the back of the garage since the summer after Rebecca died, one of 4 that her sister had helped him pack, which he had labeled and shelved and not opened since. He pulled it down on a Saturday afternoon because he was looking for the warranty documents on the garage's air compressor, which he was reasonably certain were somewhere in the middle of it. He found the warranty documents in the 3rd folder from the top. He was already putting the lid back on when he saw the envelope. It was a standard white business envelope, sealed, with his name written on the outside in Rebecca's handwriting. Below his name, also in her hand, "When you're ready." He knew about the letter. She had told him it existed. Near the end, when he was still in the phase of believing that talking about things like this meant preparing for something he could stop if he refused to prepare for it. She had said it was not a heavy letter. She had said he would know when. He sat down on the old shop stool beside the workbench and held the envelope for a while. Then he opened it. She had kept her word. It was not a heavy letter. It was written on 2 sides of a single page, in the unhurried, slightly leftward slant of her handwriting, and it was clear and direct in the way that Rebecca had always been clear and direct, which was one of the things he had loved about her and one of the things that had made losing her so specifically difficult. She did not want him to keep the space empty. That was the center of it. She did not want him to mistake honoring her memory for refusing to live forward. She wrote that Sophie would need to see him choose happiness at some point, not to erase anything, not to replace anything, but because she wanted him to keep going, and she wanted Sophie to know that love was something a person could find more than once without that meaning the first time hadn't been real. She wrote that she knew him well enough to know he would need someone to tell him it was allowed. He read it once. He folded it back along its original lines, put it in the envelope, and placed the envelope in the front pocket of the box where he would be able to find it again. Then he sat in the garage for a long time, watching the rectangle of late afternoon light move across the concrete floor. The next morning, Marcus arrived at 7:30 with 2 coffees and the news that he had, by total accident, overheard Sophie on the school bus the previous day. Marcus had been dropping off a part at the middle school next door and had paused near the elementary bus at the wrong moment. She was talking to a girl in her class, Marcus said, handing Ethan a cup. Said she was getting a new friend at home soon. Ethan took the coffee. "I thought you should know," Marcus said. He was smiling in the way he smiled when he had decided to be amused by something instead of tactful about it. Ethan didn't smile. But he also didn't say she was wrong. On Monday, Sophie spent the afternoon at Diane's house next door, a standing arrangement for days when Ethan had late jobs, though there were no late jobs that particular Monday. He drove to Granger Elementary at 3:45, which was later than dismissal, and parked in the mostly empty lot. He sat in the truck for 10 minutes with the engine off and the windows fogging slightly at the edges from his breath and the October cold outside. He was not a man given to rehearsing things, so he was not rehearsing. He was simply making sure he was actually going to go in before he wasted the drive. He had driven past Granger Elementary 100 times in 4 years. This was the first time he had parked here when he didn't have to. He got out and went in. The hallway was quiet in the way that school hallways are quiet after hours, the noise of the day still somehow present in the air, faint and recent, like the warmth left in a coffee mug. Construction paper leaves in orange and yellow were taped along the walls at child height, each one labeled with a student's name. He passed Sophie's without stopping. He found the classroom at the end of the east corridor. Door open, the lights still on. Claire was at the back shelves, stacking picture books with the focused efficiency of someone who had a system and was committed to it. She had her hair back and was still wearing her school clothes, and there was a small smear of blue marker along the edge of her left hand. She heard him in the doorway and looked up. "Mr. Cole." Not surprised, exactly. Something more neutral than that, the expression of someone who has learned not to be easily thrown. "Ethan," he said, for the second time since they had met. He stayed in the doorway. He was aware that he was framing this wrong in his head, that there was no good way to frame it, actually, so he had decided to just say it the way he would say anything that needed saying, without circling it first. "I wanted to ask you something," he said. "Next week, if you don't have plans, would you want to get coffee?" "Not because of Sophie, just because I want to." He said it evenly, not with the studied calm of someone suppressing nerves, but with the matter-of-fact directness of a man who had spent too many years saying things plainly to start being indirect now. It was the same voice he used when he told a customer what was wrong with their car clear, without embellishment, respectful of the other person's time. The room was quiet. The heater clicked somewhere in the wall. Somewhere down the hall a door opened and closed. Claire stood with a stack of picture books against her chest and looked at him the way a person looks when they are choosing carefully between several true things they could say. He could see her weighing it. He did not rush her. She set the books on the shelf. "Yes," she said. "One word. Clean and without qualification." She said it the way you say something when you have already thought it through and the answer is simply the answer. Ethan nodded. He turned toward the door. He had made it about 3 steps into the hallway when she spoke. "Ethan." He turned back. She was still standing at the shelves, one hand resting on the spines of the picture books. The afternoon light from the classroom window fell across the floor between them. "Thank you for the umbrella," she said. He looked at her for a moment from the doorway, the hallway light behind him, the classroom light in front of her, the ordinary Monday afternoon all around them, completely unremarkable and somehow not. "Sure," he said, and he went. The coffee shop on Granger's main street was called Millbrook Grounds and had been there since before Ethan could remember. It had 7 tables, a chalkboard menu, and a window that let in the morning light at an angle that turned everything on the sills warm and amber. Ethan arrived at 9:57 on Saturday morning. He ordered a black coffee and chose the table by the window and sat with his jacket still on because he hadn't decided yet whether he was going to stay or because he had decided and his body hadn't caught up. He set his coffee down and looked out at the main street, where Granger was doing its Saturday morning routine, a couple walking a dog, the hardware store owner unlocking the gate, a kid on a bicycle moving too fast through the crosswalk. Claire arrived at 10 exactly. She wore a navy sweater and dark jeans, and her hair was down instead of pulled back the way she wore it at school. She was not wearing her glasses. He had the brief, adjusting realization that she looked somewhat different without them, not more or less, just different, in the way that someone you've only seen in one context looks when you see them somewhere else. She ordered a latte at the counter, collected it, set her bag on the chair beside her, and looked at him across the table with an expression that was straightforward and slightly wary in equal measure, which struck him as honest and unexpectedly steadying. "I almost canceled," she said. "I thought about not coming," he said. They looked at each other for a moment. Then she picked up her cup and the conversation started, and it turned out to be easier than either of them had given themselves credit for. They talked for 2 hours. There was nothing dramatic about it. He told her about the routes he drove in the early mornings, county farmland roads, where the corn had been cut, and the light came up slow and clean over the flat fields. Still worth looking at after years of the same drive. She told him about arriving in Granger, parking on Main Street, and sitting in the car for 15 minutes before she could make herself get out, because the apartment was hers and only hers, and she hadn't been ready for what that felt like when it was finally true. Neither of them said the name of the place she had come from. Neither of them said the name of the person who was gone. But both of those things were present in the conversation, in the way that the walls of a room are present not the subject, but the shape everything else takes, the thing that gives the space its dimensions. He held the door for her on the way out. She stepped through and turned on the sidewalk, and the October light caught the side of her face and she squinted a little into it. "Can Sophie come next time?" she asked. He looked at her. "You sure? You won't get a word in." Claire laughed. It came out full and unguarded, the kind of laugh that happens before a person decides whether to let it, and she let it, and it was the first time he had heard her laugh like that, like she had forgotten for a moment to be careful with herself. "I'll manage," she said. 3 months later, on a Saturday morning in mid-January, Claire's Honda Civic pulled into the gravel apron in front of Ethan's garage at 9:15. The car was running fine. It had been running fine for months. She had brought it in twice since October, once for an oil change and once because a warning light had come on, and both times Ethan had fixed it and refused to charge her. Today she was not there for the car. She was there to pick up Sophie, who had been ready since 8:45 and was currently sitting on the front step of the garage in her coat, her hair in 2 braids that were only slightly uneven, a canvas bag in her lap that contained, according to Sophie, everything they would need for the farmer's market. Marcus was leaning against the garage door frame with a coffee mug, watching the proceedings with the mild satisfaction of a man who had been waiting for this particular outcome for longer than he intended to admit. Ethan stood just inside the garage bay door, jacket on, hands in his pockets. Sophie leaped off the step before the Civic had fully stopped. She yanked open the passenger door with the enthusiasm of someone who had been practicing patience for 3 months and was done with it. "Okay," she announced, "getting in. Let's go." Claire looked through the windshield at Ethan. He lifted a hand from his pocket, not quite a wave, something between a wave and an acknowledgement, and she returned it with a small tilt of her head. Marcus waited until the car had backed out of the gravel and turned toward the road before he spoke. "You good?" he asked. "Better than good," Ethan said. Marcus nodded and sipped his coffee. The Civic moved along the January road, the morning light flat and clean across the frozen fields on either side. Sophie had already turned in her seat and was telling Claire something at length and without pause, one hand gesturing at the passing landscape. Claire was nodding, glancing between the road and Sophie with the alert, willing attention of someone who had genuinely decided this was where she wanted to be. At the edge of Granger's downtown, where the road curved gently and the farmers' market tents were just visible in the distance, Claire glanced in the rearview mirror. She caught Ethan's reflection there for just a moment. He was still standing in the garage doorway, watching the road where the car had been. His hands were in his pockets. He was already turning back to something else, but before he did, she saw it. The slight ease around his eyes, the small give at the corner of his mouth. She looked away. She was smiling too, and she let herself. The car curved around the bend. The farmer's market came into view. Sophie reached over and turned up the radio.